Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL playoff primer video in the summer split. This is the video where we are going to go over everything from the end of the regular season to everything you can expect from the playoffs. We're going to be going over all of my award choices for the regular season. That's MVP, that's Rookie of the Split, that's all three of my All-Pro teams, and then we will be going in depth on every single team that ended up making either the playoffs or the play-ins. We will be talking about all of the actual playoff teams from Group Ascend, and we will be previewing the matchups that we're getting in our play-in stage, all three of them. And then, of course, at the end of the video, I will be doing my full predictive bracket for what I'm expecting from the LPL playoffs. I hope you guys are excited. This is a big one. This is a fun one. I don't want to waste too much time at the beginning. I will say, if you've enjoyed my LPL content over the course of this year, first of all, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's in the iCard right now. But if you've enjoyed my LPL content throughout this year, if you've watched all the weekly reviews, if you've seen, my takes and thoughts and opinions on a lot of these teams, then it really would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. I almost never ask for this at the beginning of videos because it's pretty unfair to ask you to like something you haven't seen yet. But if you find yourself enjoying it in 10, 20, 30 minutes, it really would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. It really does help out the channel a lot more than you know. So that's just a little, thank you for me at the beginning of the video. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. There was a lot to go over in today's video. Like I said, we've got a ton of things to cover, and that's going to at least start off with us rounding out our regular season coverage with our award picks. The award picks on this channel have been, at least at times, relatively controversial on this channel in the past. I want to remind people of the criteria that I use, and this will go over, every award pick that I have for any region, but this is a regular season award. I am strictly taking the games that I saw in the regular season in the LPL Summer Split. That's going to include both the qualification stage and the main stage. Both stages here were factored in to me choosing my decision, but I've seen a lot of people say, like, how can you put X player above, Y player? They're way worse. Like, you yourself have said that they're not as good of a player. Well, it doesn't matter how good or bad I think they're going to do moving forward. It doesn't matter how good or bad I think they are in comparison to other players in their role. This is purely who do I think added more value to their team in the regular season. So that's the criteria that I want to land on. And of course, as I just said there, to me, it's all about value. There can be players that I think maybe were individually very good and very talented, but we're a part of a cog. We're more of a part of the machine. We've seen this in the past. A lot of All-Pro teams kind of just evolve into putting the best teams as the All-Pros. Like, the number 1 seed gets all the first team, number 2 seed gets all the second team. I think that that's pretty dumb. I think that that's not really indicative of who was standing out. And so, value is the term that I like to coin. Now, that can mean a lot of different things to different people. I just want to establish where my personal criteria is coming from. Who do I think personally added more wins individually to their team in comparison to other players in the league? So you might see some players from teams that aren't quite as successful. If they really were the players that were carrying that team for a lot of the split, if they were a lot more consistent, then maybe people are giving them credit for, I'm not just going to go off of team record like sometimes the actual LPL awards and the LCK awards and all the other awards like to do. So that's just a bit of a disclaimer. I know you guys are probably going to have different opinions, so let me know what you agree with or disagree with. Just, of course, conversationally. Don't just yell at me and pretend like did you even watch the games? Of course I watch the games. I have a channel that goes over every single game in the LPL. So, if you're willing to have a conversation, I'd love to have that down in the comment section below. Let me know what you agree or disagree with. There's no way that we're going to agree on everything. So, with all that out of the way, with the preamble done, let's get into the analysis, and that's going to start off, of course, with the big one. We're going to kick it off with the most important award, the most valuable player. And anyone who's been following the channel and how I've been talking about the LPL over the course of this year, they're not going to be surprised by this pick. In fact, I've basically come out and said it on this channel multiple times. My Summer Split 2024 MVP in the LPL is going to go to Elk, the 80 carry for Bilibili Gaming. This felt like a very easy decision for me. This was a 2-horse race for a majority of the split. It was him and Kanavi that were kind of going back and forth. Kanavi had a really rough end of the split. Elk just continued to stay at a really high level. This felt like a very obvious decision in my brain. I do not think he's going to win MVP. I think that there were other players that were a tad bit flashier in terms of what they were able to do, but it's just hard not to watch Bilibili games, especially from the beginning of the split, and not see Elk at times genuinely 1v9ing. I think that there is a real strong case to be made right now that he is the best AD carry in the world. I think that there is genuinely an argument on that front. I think this meta really fits him well, and generally speaking, I think Elk is fantastic. I'll quickly go over what you're seeing on the screen. Of course, obviously the name and the MVP award and the role and the team and all that stuff is pretty self-explanatory. The champions are his 3 most played champions with their win-loss record. LPL Player of the Game awards is how many Player of the Games he got officially on the broadcast in the LPL. And then below that, for Player of the Series, that's how many Player of the Series I gave him on my channel, going over every single series. Of course, I gave 1 Player of the Series, 1 Dud of the Series for every series that we covered. That's every single series in the LPL across this split, and so he got 4. Spoiler alert, that's the most of anybody in the league. It's tied for the most, but it is the most, and so I know it feels like it's a really low number, but you have to remember, a lot of these series, you can be Player of the Game twice. Maybe in one series, Elk in particular was Player of the Game at least once in a series, basically every single time Bilibili played something, and so, you know, maybe not every single series revolved around Elk, but there really wasn't a player in the league that felt like the dominant force, where it really felt like there was no other choice. Elk, to me, was just the most consistent in terms of that regard. I think he carried over a lot of his good form from last split into the beginning of the split, and then obviously translated that into more consistent success later on in the split as well. So he was a pretty easy choice for MVP. Bilibili is looking like the best team in the league, at least at the moment. Not going to spoil my playoff bracket predictions, but I don't think it's controversial to say that Bilibili's a very good team. I think Elk has been able to provide a lot of value, regardless of what they've wanted to do in terms of play style. You know, BLG is a team that's switched up its style a lot over the course of this year because of the new jungler. So, you know, having him be really good in these really high, you know, high energy, fast-paced comps that want to win early like they had with Shun was really good, but also being able to slow down the game and have him win in the mid game with this really good positioning, it's also very valuable. Elk's just a very good player, so I don't think this is going to be the most popular pick or the most common pick in the world, but I'm going to go with Elk. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he wins MVP and I don't have a good read on things, but I don't think that he's going to win the LPL MVP, but he is my pick. My honorable mentions, my second and third place votes here. In second, it's actually going to go to Tian, and this was Kanavi for forever. Again, I talked about it. It was kind of a 2-horse race for a really long time between Elk and Kanavi for me, but Kanavi was really bad down the stretch. Like, the last 2 weeks of the regular season really kind of put me off on having Kanavi as one of my top 2 picks here in MVP voting, and, you know, we'll get to him in a second, but Tian is the one who kind of overtook that spot. Say what you will about top esports, but Tian was unbelievable over the course of this split. He was never really the most dominant in the way that we've seen other junglers in the past play, but you could definitely make an argument that this was his best regular season ever. That there is certainly a real conversation to have in that regard. The jungle mid duo of top esports was unstoppable for a lot of this split. We'll talk about Cream a bit later because he also had his best split of his entire career. It's just looking really good. I think top esports is one of the best teams in the world still, and Tian was probably the most valuable player in terms of generating those resources in the regular season, which is a really good thing to say. And then we talked about Kanavi. Unbelievable start to the split, but I think kind of the setup of JD Gaming actually started to get to him a bit. He really did have to 1v9 a lot of the series that they ended up playing, especially in the back half of the split, and I think that really created a dichotomy where he was taking a lot more risks than he needed to. So even when other players on the team started to step up, you know, Ruler I think had a really good split, you know, Missing was pretty good this split, Sheer definitely had his moments, Yagao had his moments, like there were pluses and minuses for everybody else, but because I think he had gotten into the groove of having to 1v9 or 2v8 a lot of these games, sometimes he was going for 50-50s that he just really shouldn't have in a lot of circumstances, and it did hold him back a bit. But, you know, there are a lot of games that JDG just simply would not have won if Kanavi wasn't their jungler. I still think it's fair to call him one of the top 2 to 3 junglers in the world. I think that that is a super fair argument to make. There's just a little bit more question marks about him after the last 2 weeks than there were at any point before that, in my opinion. That's kind of true for JD Gaming just in general, but it's the reason that he does rank a little bit lower in third place in terms of my MVP voting. But if we're talking about, oh, he's only third place in my MVP voting, that's still a pretty good result for Kanavi. So, you know, Kanavi in third, Tian in second, and Elk as my MVP. Again, I don't know how popular or controversial that take is going to be, but it's certainly what I'm going to stick to. But then moving on to the other major award that we have here, at least individual major award that we have in the LPL, and that's going to be the Rookie of the Split. I already gave one for the spring split. I know they generally do a Rookie of the Year. Spoiler alert, it's not going to matter for me. It will probably be the same for everybody, but my Rookie of the Split was a pretty easy decision. It is going to go to Milky Way, the jungler for FunPlus Phoenix. This was not hard. This was not a decision I had to think on for a really long time or anything like that. This was a pretty easy choice, whether it be for Rookie of the Year or Rookie of the Split. He has clearly been the best rookie in the LPL in 2024. I know some people are going to get a little like, well, Milky Way actually was exposed a bit down the stretch of the regular season. I think there are fair responses to that in saying that, yeah, Milky Way did definitely have some weaknesses exposed down the stretch, but if you'd followed the channel, you probably saw this coming, because the way I've been talking about Milky Way since like the middle of the spring split is the exact same way I'm talking about him now. I think the exact same of him now as I did back then. For all the people that were hyping him up a ton as an MVP finalist, which I was doing, you know, in terms of his performances in the spring split, this is the same player. He just had a different set of circumstances surrounding it, you know, going into the summer split. He is awesome, absolutely dominant at taking care and beating people that he is better than. If he is more mechanically talented than you, if he can get these gigantic leads in the early game in particular, you just don't really have a chance of being able to stop him, because he is so oppressive at playing from an advantageous state, at playing from a lead. The problem for Milky Way is that when he has to play from neutral, a lot of the things that he's really good at aren't quite as useful, unless you're just like skirmishing all the time. And teams just don't necessarily do that into FPX all that much anymore. And so when you face the best teams in the league regularly, if you're in Group Ascend, yeah, you're probably going to look worse if you're someone like Milky Way than if you were playing, you know, every team in the league at an even amount. And so I'm not really all that surprised to see Milky Way struggle a bit down the stretch of the regular season. But even taking that into account, basically every series that FPX won this year was off the back of Milky Way. There was just no other answer to this question. They're going to be, you know, a top 6 or top 7 team. They're in the playoffs, and they have a rookie as their best player, especially with the rookie class that we got in 2024. That's a really easy decision for me to make Rookie of the Split, if you will. And then honorable mentions, my second and third place votes. Starry is going to get my second place vote. Talk about someone who kind of had the opposite trajectory of Milky Way, where he started off really bad at the start of the split when OMG was an absolute disaster in the qualification stage. It looked like getting rid of Abel and promoting Starry was going to be a massive mistake. And it turns out that actually ended up really working out for this team. He was awesome down the stretch in the main stage, and he is probably the biggest reason why that team had an emergence. I understand people will talk about Tianjen coming in, and we will speak on him in just a second, but Starry, I think, was the player who stepped up, who needed to step up the most. Angel getting back into form was great for OMG, but if Starry was just kind of a bad AD carry, if he was one of the weaker ADCs in the entire league, this team would not be sitting here, you know, in first place in Group Nirvana. So Starry was a big part of that success. And then Tianjen, this is a good time to bring up something that I do want to say. Starry and Tianjen might not technically qualify for Rookie of the Year or Rookie of the Split. I'm not entirely sure how it works in the LPL. I know some regions are, if you've ever played a game before, then you don't qualify for Rookie of the Year. If you've played before 2024 at a major region, then it just doesn't count. I'm not going to take that into account here. I don't think that that's necessarily a fair way to look at it. Starry and Tianjen have never been full-time starters. I know Tianjen's played a little bit before 2024. I know Starry played like a week or something last year in substitution for Abel. I'm not counting those. They are essentially rookies. This is their first actual like starting job or starting year in the LPL, and so I'm counting them as rookies. If you want to take them out, put Sheer in here. Like, I'll talk about it now. Sheer is getting kind of snubbed from this list because, honestly, he really wasn't consistent. Like, he was not particularly great over the course of this split, and he's a big reason why I think I'm a little bit lower on JD Gaming right now, is I just don't know if he's going to be able to step up against the other best teams in the LPL game after game after game, but if you really, really wanted to make it like only people who have never played before 2024, then just slot Sheer somewhere in here. But I'm going to put Tianjen on this list. He is an interesting player because I was so negative and so low on him when he was on Invictus Gaming earlier on in the year. And, you know, rightfully so. He was horrible on that team, and he really didn't show a lot of promise. He didn't show a lot of flexibility. He was really bad for the meta. But the meta shifted. All of a sudden, we got an AP jungle meta, and you got a lot more carrying coming out of that position. Tianjen gets picked up by OMG, and it really does feel like he's cleaned up a lot of the mistakes that he was making. The shot calling seems to be a lot more efficient. The early games in general just seem to be a lot more efficient, and he's always been a really good team fighter. It's always kind of been his strength as a player. He's just never really been able to get to that point in the top region, but he did a really good job here on OMG of coming in, stabilizing the team, and quite frankly, just making them better. I did not think he was going to be an upgrade to Zhao Fang, who probably would have been on this list, was on this list in the spring split, but Tianjen was definitely an upgrade when he came in, so Happy to have two OMG guys here, but really at the end of the day, this was Milky Way's like rookie of the split to lose, and he did not lose it. He was pretty good over the course of this split, even if there were some more up and downs than there were in spring. But now that we've got the big individual awards out of the way, it's time to get into my all-pro teams. We've done MVP, we've done Rookie of the Split. Let's get into the players that I think were the best in their individual positions. There are a lot of caveats, as there always are, and I have to say this again. I know I said this at the beginning of the video, but I get comments like this every single year that I do this, and so I really want to make sure to specify my grading criteria might be different than yours. My way of analyzing these players might not be exactly identical to how you think they should be analyzed, and that's fine. I do want to establish that my grading scale, as I said before, is who do I think added the most amount of value to their individual teams, who do I think individually made their teams better and popped off more with the resources that they were given. Sometimes that can be a little bit too advantageous to the people who were the number 1 or the number 2 option on their team, but if you're the number 4 or 5 option on the best team in the league, you're probably not an all-pro, just because it's really hard to be able to your job's not as difficult, I will say, in that role, and I've said that in years past, right? Like, sometimes you can be the worst player on the best team in the world, and you might not be an all-pro caliber player, even if you are, if your stats are great and your KDA is great and all that kind of stuff, and so there is a lot, at least in my mind, that goes into trying to calculate this. I also want to say, like, it is very variable. It is a weird split. It's a weird setup. Group Ascend, Group Nirvana. It makes it much more difficult to try and identify players that were over or underperforming, because a lot of the players that were underperforming at the beginning of the split ended up playing worse competition, and so it's really hard to get an idea of where everybody lands. It's just a few caveats, and, I'll go over each individual player. Also, the big one that I can't believe I forgot to mention, every position is different in terms of quality. That is just very clear. You could have a player who's third team in one of these that would be first team in a different position, right? Some positions are just straight up stronger than others. In my opinion, right now, jungle is incredibly deep at the LPL level. AD carry is obviously very deep at the LPL level, at least in terms of all pro caliber players, whereas top lane, maybe not so much. Mid lane, at least at the high end level, a little bit difficult to narrow down 3 players that were great the whole split. So I hope you can understand that. Like, some positions are just going to be a bit deeper than others, and that means players that you might be surprised to see high up on, all pro lists are going to be there just because there aren't suitable other players to kind of fill that role. So we'll talk about that, when we come across them, but we're going to start, of course, with first team, with all of that out of the way, and first team is up on the screen now. You can notice only 2 teams represented in my first team all-pro. Bilibili and Top Esports, in my opinion, the 2 best teams in the LPL right now. I really wanted to kind of move some pieces around, and I was shocked to see that this is how it ended up turning out, but at the end of the day, these were the 5 players that I thought were the most impactful in terms of their individual positions so far in the regular season. We'll go over it. Top lane is, of course, Bin from Bilibili Gaming. Jungle is Tian from Top Esports. Mid lane is Cream from Top Esports. AD carries, of course, Elk from Bilibili Gaming. And support is Mako from Top Esports. Well, how can you add so many wins to a team that ended up going 6-2? I know that's going to be a question. There's no LNG players here. For me, this has a lot to do, obviously, with the fact that qualification and main stage are taken into account. And so the 6-2 from Top Esports is juxtaposed by the fact that they ran their qualification stage. And not to mention, a lot of the positions that they are excelling in, like mid lane, like support, they weren't exactly the strongest positions, at least in terms of carrying this split. Junglers and AD carries definitely received the most attention, in my opinion, from, these carry performances and from, putting their teams on their back. And that means that sometimes you have to go for some players that might not be getting as much recognition, that I think were able to enable a lot of things a little bit more than maybe other players in their roles. So we'll talk about it here. We'll start with Bin, of course, in the top lane. Bin is excellent. Like, what do you want me to say? He's the best top laner in the LPL. This is the one thing on here that I don't think will be a surprise to anyone. This is the easiest selection I had to make. Top lane is a super weak role, at least in terms of depth and honestly just general talent right now in the LPL, and Bin is so clearly above everybody else. He was awesome in the regular season. He is arguably the number 1 top laner in the world, and yeah, he's first team all-pro. This was not a tough decision. We already talked about his teammate Elk. I don't think I have to go too in-depth on that. If I, am making him my MVP, he probably should be first team all-pro. He was the best AD carry in the league, and in my opinion, the most valuable player in the league. Similar story with Tian, who I already talked about quite a bit in my MVP, section, just because he was my runner-up, my honorable mention, my second place MVP vote. This was also not a difficult decision. He was able to create the most amount of tempo for Top Esports of anybody on that team over the course of this year, and he really didn't have any bad games. The consistency was definitely there for him. But I think what might be surprising is Cream getting my first team All-Pro nod here in the mid lane. You know, mid lane was kind of a weird role to try and analyze because typically speaking, you have a couple of players that you just know are going to be All-Pros that are going to dominate. You know, Knight definitely comes to mind on that, and we'll talk about him a bit later, but nobody really had that consistent all the way through type of split other than Cream, which I definitely came as a surprise to me, but you can't really point out a ton of bad games from Cream in the summer split. He has truly just been excellent for this team. I've made the claim, I should say, multiple times on this channel that Tian and Cream right now are the best mid-jungle duo in the LPL, and I think that that's representative here of a first-team All-Pro spot. I just think Cream was the only player that I really felt good about in every single game, whereas a lot of other mid laners had higher highs, I would say better best games, but their bad games were also worse than Cream's. I just don't think Cream had really any negative games over the course of this split, or at least no negative like stretches over the course of this split. And that, if that's not first team All-Pro, especially because the highs have gotten better for him, I don't know what is. He's an incredibly good player. And then Mako, this is another one that I don't think will be all that controversial. Mako is just ridiculous. This is the perfect meta for him because this is kind of the jack of all trades meta, as I've talked about for supports for a while. So playing support right now is harder than it has been in many years because you kind of have to do everything. It's not like the Enchanter meta where you really just kind of have to focus on lane and then in the late game enabling your ADC. This is not like the roaming meta that we got a couple of years ago where it was just, you know, forget about lane, try to get out on the map and use your macro to affect the game as much as possible. You really have to do a bit of everything right now in order to make sure that your team is in a good position going into the mid to late game. And Mako is fortunate in that sense because he is good at everything. He is a very all-around type of player, and this is the exact kind of meta to enable people like that to really look great. I think Mako, for most of this year, has looked like the best support in the world. And I think this first team All-Pro nod is definitely indicative of that. Some people might think that this is too much top esports. This is too high for 3 top esports players. Trust me, we'll talk about, you know, some of the other ones as we move forward. Not every single TES member is going to get an All-Pro nod. Cough, cough, 369, who's just not after how he played this split. But I really wanted to highlight the players who were playing well. The BLG players, I don't think anyone is going to be all that surprised about. But definitely, I'm interested to see the reaction to this first team. But then moving into my second team All-Pro, that's going to be up on the screen now. There again are some interesting things here, but this one I think is a lot more expected. I think a lot of these players are going to get first team All-Pro votes from a lot of the people on the committee, from the broadcast itself. But for me, they come in just below kind of that upper tier because a lot of them had very great moments, but also some up and down moments, which we will talk about. But my second team All-Pro is Zika, the top laner for LNG, Kanavi, the jungler for JD Gaming, Knight, the mid laner for Bilibili Gaming, Ruler, the AD carry for JD Gaming, and Hong, the support for LNG Esports. So definitely a bit of an interesting group. We're going to start with the JDG boys because, you know, I've talked about it a lot this year, but it is kind of a 2v8 in a lot of games for JDG right now. Even Missing isn't performing particularly well, but the solo lanes very documentably have been not very good. Yagao is super out of meta. This AD carry in the mid lane meta is just not something that Yagao works really well with. He's not a great AD mid player. And then Sheer has definitely found his kind of inconsistencies in the league. He looked so good in his first couple of series, but you know, an extended stretch will really show you what happens when teams can prepare and have more tape on a player and can actually start to, like, figure out how they want to play against him. Sheer is not necessarily adapted super well just yet. He's still obviously super inexperienced. I'm not going to write him off, but Kanavi and Ruler have had to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and I think both of them are very deserving of this second team. Kanavi would have been first team. He probably would have been the MVP if he hadn't really struggled down the stretch. I was very much leaning in favor of a Kanavi MVP, like, after week 3 of the main stage, but he just couldn't quite hold on to it. The last couple of weeks were definitely a bit rough for him. We already talked about him a bit, but he was excellent for a majority of the split. Tian just kind of passed him in terms of the consistency at the end for me. And then Ruler had a phenomenal bounce back split. Again, if Elk wasn't so good, Ruler probably would have been first team All-Pro in most splits with how he was able to play. I think he was way more consistent than Kanavi. The problem is I don't think he had the same kind of highs as Kanavi did. It's always been Ruler as a player. He's fit really well into systems where you're on really good teams. He's not the best number 1 option in the world. He can do it, obviously. Go look at 2022 on Gen G. I really do think that that's a year where it's like Ruler was just enabled to be the best player in the world for a lot of that year, but a lot of that was because he plays really well within structure and he's a great mid-game player. He's not the kind of guy where if the rest of the team is just like straight up losing, that he can like salvage it in the same way that like Kanavi or someone like that can, so I understand why maybe his highs aren't as high. That being said, like, what I'm saying by aren't as high is like, oh, he's only like the 4th or the 5th best player in terms of performances in the league. Like, I'm really not trying to shit on Ruler. Anybody who's followed the channel knows, like, I'm a huge Ruler fan. I think he's the best AD carry of all time, and so I'm really not trying to disrespect him, but especially after the spring split, which I think was a bit down, this was definitely a lot better here in summer. Then you've got the 2 LNG boys, top and support here. Zika's gonna get my second team All-Pro nod. This feels entirely wrong to me. This doesn't feel like something that should be justifiable because he was so bad in the qualification stage, and obviously he turned it on a lot in the main stage. He was excellent for LNG, maybe the best top laner outside of BIM in the main stage, and I would say certainly, probably now that I think about it, the best top laner outside of BIM in the main stage. But how can you play the first half of a split so poorly and still get second team All-Pro? Well, top lane kind of sucks right now at the LPL level. No one's been able to win consistently. Nobody's looked good really for any extended period of time, and so Zika looking really good for the more important part of the split. Yeah, that's probably good enough for the second team All-Pro. I don't feel great about it either, but at least he was able to turn it on when it started mattering the most, and LNG obviously really profited from it. And then Hong, this was a less controversial decision for me. This guy is awesome. The LNG bot lane is awesome. Gala is right on the same level as Hong in my opinion, if not a slightly better player. But again, we'll talk about it here. Like, AD carry is just a harder role to break into in terms of All-Pro teams than support is. There aren't as many supports that were really dominating because of the meta shift over the course of this split, where so much was asked of them in the early and in the mid game. Hong really responded to that well. Every single time this guy has gotten playing time, whether it's on Rare Atom, whether it's on FPX, whether it's on LNG, he has hit it out of the park. He is an absolute star in the support position. He is an A, caliber player, an AA- caliber player, and he continues to prove that every single time he plays. I'm no longer going to try to disrespect Hong. He is awesome, and he deserves the second team All-Pro nod. And then Knight in the mid lane, kind of the guy who has notoriously occupied my first team All-Pro for years and years and years now, and obviously I'm still very in on Knight. I have pushed back on a lot of the people that were doom and gloom about him when he was underperforming a bit in the beginning part of this split, kind of towards the middle of this split, but it is worth noting that that stretch is kind of what cost him first team for me. The consistency just wasn't quite there. He's rebounded unbelievably well. He just set the kill record in the LPL in the final week of the season. I think he's going to be just fine going into playoffs, and he's a big reason why Bilibili are still major favorites to win the entire split for a lot of people, but at least in terms of what I saw in the regular season, he just wasn't quite as consistent as Cream was, and that's why he drops here to second team. But a lot of familiar names on second team. Some might be a little bit shocking to see, down here on the second team and not on the first team, but I think hopefully I went over it and kind of explained why they were maybe a bit more inconsistent than they're going to get credit for. And then moving on to our third team All-Pro, it's up on the screen. Now this one I'm going to go through a bit quicker. I think the difference between the third team and, who I had fourth or fifth, or as the honorable mentions, if you will, in a lot of these cases is very small, very minute. I think that there are a lot of options for a couple of these positions, but I will quickly go over why I chose each. First of all, the third team is Ale, the top laner from Anyone's Legend, Tarzan, the jungler from Weibo Gaming, Scout, the mid laner from LNG Esports, Jackie Love, the AD carry from Top Esports, and On, the support from Bilibili Gaming. These were the players that I felt the least good about not including on the list. I think that there were a lot of options for quite a few of these positions. I'm going to touch upon the ones I felt the best about. First, that being Tarzan. Jungle is just such a ridiculously good position in the LPL right now. Tarzan, with the way that he played this split, in most cases would be like a first or a second team All-Pro. He was awesome over the course of this split, was by far the best player on Weibo Gaming, was super consistent for them and continuously put them over the top. He is the most aggressive jungler in the LPL, and it shows game after game, and he does it on things like Sejuani. It allows him to get away with a lot of his aggressive pathing, if you will, and I think he's incredibly underrated. People are still going to try to stick to their narrative that Tarzan was the problem because League of Legends fans don't like to admit when they're wrong. At the end of the day, Tarzan has been nothing but phenomenal for Weibo. Maybe a bit inconsistent, if only because of the playstyle that he has adopted, for the rest of the team as that kind of leader. They were really struggling at the beginning of the split without having a true carry, someone to really get a lot of the resources in the early game. The moment that Tarzan really stepped up and said, screw it, I'm going to do that, Weibo got a lot better and instantly became a lot more consistent. So Tarzan more than has deserved his place on the All-Pro team here, and honestly, I just feel bad about not being able to put him higher. On is the other player that I feel really comfortable about in this spot. There were quite a few supports that I think were battling it out over this third and final spot, but I just couldn't justify On not being on the list. Like, Elk was so amazing, and yes, On had multiple games this split where he completely inted, but a lot of Elk's success can be attributed to how good On is in lane. And so if Elk's going to be my MVP, it just felt really wrong to leave On off these all-pro teams. He's going to get a third place spot, even though he was, like, again, very inconsistent over the course of this split. And then Jackie Love, the only reason I didn't say his name earlier in terms of, like, players that I had locked in for this third team is not because Jackie Love was bad. We talked about why Mako was very good. Jackie Love is arguably just as good as Mako. Didn't receive a lot of resources, played weak side for a lot of this split, but honestly, that's super encouraging for a player like Jackie Love that we know can take over team fights in the back half of the game. If he doesn't need a lot of resources in this meta early on, that's huge for top esports, and that's allowed them to play through Tion and Cream a bit more, which has really helped those players out. But the only reason I didn't mention him as a lock as much as some of the others is because AD carry was a tough role to narrow down, man. There are snubs on this list. Gala is a massive snub on this list. Honestly, On, the AD carry for Invictus Gaming, like, I really considered him for third team because I don't know if there was anyone in Group Nirvana that hard carried their team quite as much as On. He really was that good for IG. He's somebody that I really hope gets picked up by a big team next year and isn't stuck just trying to carry, you know, a bad group of players across the finish line, but I just couldn't justify leaving Jackie Love off, and unfortunately, that means Gala and On both don't make the list, even though I very heavily considered them. And then the two that I think are going to be a bit more controversial, we'll start with Scout in the mid lane. This one definitely is more recency bias. He essentially has the same arc as his teammate Zika earlier on. He just did it a little bit more aggressively, right? Where the bad games in the beginning of the split and last split obviously were really bad. I'm not going to try to justify those. I will justify it and say that I think there were less bad games this split than people realize. I think a lot of people were attributing his negative form to this split when a lot of it was last split, and he got better, I think, in this split a lot quicker than people are giving him credit for, even in the qualification stage, but he definitely turned it on once they hit the main stage. They're 7-1 for a reason. He has been the primary carry for LNG, and I just couldn't justify leaving him off this list when, especially for the last, like, 4 weeks, when it's been the most important games of the entire split. He's been one of the top, like, 3 to 5 players in the LPL. It's just really hard for me to justify not having that player in an all-pro team, even if he was inconsistent. Again, I don't think there was anybody else that I felt great about here. Shanks was, of course, the other player that I really considered, and a lot of people are probably going to have Shanks in their all-pro teams. I just couldn't do that. I don't think Shanks was an all-pro caliber player this split. He's run into the same problems that he's run into every single time that he's had one of these big splits, and that the beginning of the split looks amazing and the last 3 weeks look horrible, and that's just kind of the general trend for Shanks, and I just couldn't justify that when the games got more important, when he faced tougher competition, that's when he started playing worse, where it was kind of the opposite for someone like Scout. It meant that I just couldn't reasonably put him in my all-pro team, but definitely considered him, and again, I'm not trying to be low on Shanks, I just know people are really high on him, so I figured I'd address it. And then Ale in the top lane. How the hell is Ale an all-pro? I don't feel good about this even a little bit, but truly, like, name me someone else that deserves to go here. 369 was not very good this split. I think a lot of people are going to underestimate that. Sheer was somebody that got a lot of hype, but certainly, you know, wasn't consistent in that regard. I'm not going to put Breathe in here. He had some miserable performances at the beginning of the split. At the very least, Ale won quite a few games for AL at the beginning of the split. He's kind of the inverse of Zika. The reason Zika ends up on second team and Ale ends up on third team is because Zika did it in the second half and Ale did it in the first half. He had a really kind of rough end to the split, especially the last couple of weeks, but the start of the split was pretty good for him. When AL was really clicking, Ale was one of the big reasons why, and especially in a very weakened top lane, he ends up grabbing that third team all-pro spot. Again, there just really aren't other options. If you could suggest somebody that you genuinely think deserves that spot more, I'm happy to listen, because I don't feel good about Ale being an all-pro, but I just couldn't, you know, figure anybody out. Like, there was nobody that came to mind when looking over the stats, when looking over my analysis, when looking over all the metrics that I track. There was just nobody else that came to mind as anyone that even deserved to be in the conversation. Ale was really the only one who had any part of the split be all-pro caliber, so he ends up getting that third team. Again, as you can see, there are some questionable choices here, even from me, in terms of me saying, like, I don't know if I feel good about this, but that's mostly because the LPL was so variable this split. The new format really did affect, I think, me and a lot of other people's views on these players. It means the players that did really well and were really consistent were rewarded more, like your first team MVP caliber players. I think it was even more impressive for them, but you get down to the fringes here and you're going to have to take some of the good with the bad. And so I'm interested to hear what you guys think about with the all-pro teams. Who did I leave off that I didn't mention? You know, I mentioned some honorable mentions like Gala for some of these positions. Let me know who you think I should have considered that maybe I didn't mention in this video. I'm always interested to hear your thoughts and opinions, but with all the awards out of the way, 30 plus minutes into this video, it's finally time to head into the team analysis for the playoffs. And the team analysis, we shall start. If you are new to this section, what we're going to do is go through numbers 1 through 7, first and foremost, talking about the teams that don't necessarily have an opponent just yet for the first round of the playoffs for them. And then once we get to teams 8 and beyond, the teams that are in the play-in stage, we're going to talk about them in the context of their matchup, not necessarily just individually, because quite frankly, at this point in the year, it's irrelevant what you are as a team if it matches up poorly against the team that you're playing into. You've only got one shot. If you lose a best of 5, you are done, at least for every team except for the top 2. So it's kind of irrelevant if you are, good in a lot of circumstances, except for the one that you're in. So we'll talk about them in terms of their matchup, but we're going to start off going from number 1 downwards, and that means starting off with the number 1 seed, your defending LPL champions, Bilibili Gaming. They do end up with the number 1 seed, even after some tumultuous times. I say that, yet they were 7-1, 15-7, not too tumultuous in terms of record, but this team certainly went through its ups and downs in terms of, good and bad performances, so much so that they had to make a roster change in the middle of the split as the defending LPL champions, as the team that made the MSI finals. They ended up switching out their jungle, and we'll talk about that, but what we're going to do for most of this section is go over the team itself. The players we will touch upon. This is something that's going to be a little bit different than how I've done it in years past. I'm not going to go super in depth on individual players. I will mostly be talking about the team. This is really about how do I think the team is going to perform? What is their style? What are the things they're good at? What are the things they're bad at? That's more of what we are going to talk about and adjust here. So we'll get into that, but of course their lineup, Bilibili's lineup, is looking like Bin in the top lane, Wei in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, Elkid AD carry, and On at support. If you haven't been watching the LPL, you might be a bit surprised to see Wei starting in the jungle here for BLG. This was a choice that they made about midway through the main stage to bring him in and replace Shun with him. Shun is now just benched on this team. They didn't trade him away. He didn't go anywhere. It's just Wei starting over him. It's certainly an interesting decision. At the time, I very much panned it. I thought it was a major mistake, not only because you just didn't know what you were going to get from Wei, because quite frankly, he has not been particularly good, not only this year, but really in the last 2 or 3 years. He's not been all that great as a jungle in terms of the performances he's been putting out for RNG, but even on top of that, as much as Shun was a bit of a liability at the top level when you're talking about him going up against MSI finalist caliber junglers, he couldn't go up against Canyon and survive, Shun was awesome domestically, and for the most part was clearly a top 3 to 4 jungler in the LPL. I just didn't know if you were going to be getting an upgrade there in Wei, but so far at the very least, I've been proven wrong. He has been awesome for this team. He's come in and really changed up their style, and that's really the first thing I want to address. Like I said, mostly going to be covering the play styles here instead of the individual players. The play style for Bilibili has changed so much over the course of this split. Obviously, at the beginning, they were a lot closer to what they were in 2023, this very fast-paced, skirmish-oriented team. That kind of transitioned away, especially when Wei came in. It was already starting to move in that direction. They were already starting to get a bit more quote-unquote clinical in terms of how they played the game, but Wei has slowed things down tremendously. They're 5th in the league in game duration. I would have guessed they were probably 1st or 2nd before Wei ended up coming in. Especially in their wins, they are not all that quick anymore. And it's very clear that Wei has come in and been a primary shot caller for this team. Is that a positive? Is that a negative? That's something we're going to have to see moving forward. We haven't really seen this team tested, at least at a top level, with someone like Wei shot calling in the jungle. But one thing is for sure, they're not taking as big a risk. And that's definitely something that I think could help. Elk and On, they're still playing aggressive in the bot lane, but they're not trying to dominate the 2v2 in the way they were earlier in the year. They're definitely a bit more controlled chaos, playing for mid and late game. Knight is definitely the player that you've noticed the change in the most. He really struggled at first trying to adapt to playing for late game team fights more than early game roaming skirmishes, but he's definitely found his footing, as was pretty indicative in, his win at the end of the final week of the regular season, where he set the kill record for the LPL. Bin, I think, has never really struggled. His playstyle really hasn't changed at all. He's the best team fighting top laner in the world. That's not even a debate. He is the best team fighter. You can argue that, laning phase, he's only top 5, but he's number 1 in terms of grouping 5v5, so it's not even really a conversation. But it's all just going to be about whether or not this team's style ends up actually coming back to hurt them. Our team's going to be too aggressive for them, and they're going to need to switch back. Is Shun something that they're considering as a 6th man, a potential sub, if things are a little bit problematic in terms of playstyle? It's going to be interesting. Right now, they've really not had to worry about that, though, because Wei has been that good for this team. I expect him to continue to be that good, at least for now, and this team is favorites for a reason. You can see 4 all-pros on this team. The MVP for me was on this team. The only player that didn't get it was Wei, away, and that's only because he played half the split. If he had played the entire split the way that he did in the second half, then he would have gotten an All-Pro nod. And so, you know, obviously I feel very good about Bilibili Gaming. I will say there are some #1 teams in other regions like Gen G over in the LCK, or obviously G2 over in the LEC, where it's like, oh, it would be a major shock if they lost the finals. That's not quite the case with Bilibili. I think they are more beatable than maybe some other top teams because they aren't exactly perfect, but they are favorites for a reason, and they're going to be going into playoffs with that expectation. But then moving on to the #2 seed. #2 gets the same privileges as #1 in terms of the seeding here in the LPL playoffs. Of course, they get an immediate bye into the double elimination round, the top 4, if you will. They are guaranteed that. However, they're not going to be on the same, path in terms of the right side of the bracket. Having to face potentially the #3 seed is a lot worse than having to face the #4 seed, but still a top 2 team that maybe is surprising people. It's LNG Esports. They also finished 7-1 in the regular season, but their game score was just slightly worse at 14-7, so they end up at the #2 seed. People did not expect this team to land in the upper echelon of, these teams at 7-1 in particular. Coming out of the group stage or the qualification stage, the first half of the split, they actually looked a lot better, I think, than they were given credit for. They weren't exactly awful. I had them in my top 5 in terms of my power rankings. That definitely received some criticism. You heard the buzzword of fraud thrown out a lot for LNG and quite a few other teams that obviously were proven to be false because that word means absolutely nothing, and I hope it's deleted from the League of Legends lexicon because it just doesn't actually track. You heard that phrase thrown out a lot for LNG. They came out in the second half and really proved that wrong. What exactly changed? Well, we'll get into it when we talk about the playstyle, but their lineup is looking like Zika in the top lane, Weiwei in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Gala at AD carry, and Hong at support. Really, if you followed the channel, you know what I'm going to say here. Honestly, you can probably skip this section if you're a longtime fan and you watch like all of the content here, because I'm going to be repeating a lot of what I've said in my regular season reviews. If you're not familiar with my take on this, here it goes. LNG really struggled in the spring split because they couldn't really settle on a playstyle. Weiwei and Scout in particular had anti-synergy, negative chemistry, if you will, as a mid-jungle duo. Scout, somebody who loves to play front-to-back 5v5s, likes to scale into the late game, really does not want to be super active in the early game, doesn't like to take a lot of these skirmishes, doesn't really like to push the tempo, wants to play a more calm, calculated game where he gets a lot of resources and scales up. Weiwei is kind of the opposite, or at least that's what he's been over the course of his career. When you watched him on Weibo last year, his biggest thing was that he was skirmishing all the time in the early game, one of the more aggressive junglers in terms of being willing to just fight over objectives and to call his teammates to a lot of things, also kind of a resource carry. And so you were sitting in this dilemma where Weiwei wanted to fight all the time, and if Scout went to go help him, then Scout was doing the thing that he was bad at, and oftentimes they would lose that fight because Scout was really struggling. Or Scout wouldn't go, Weiwei would get caught out and look really bad, and Scout wouldn't get the resources he needed to scale into the late game because the enemy mid laner would get a lot of gold from his jungle. And so ended up just being a real big struggle for LNG because they couldn't quite land on how they wanted to approach the early game. And then all of a sudden, this new meta hits coming into the summer split, and things start to get better. I think AP junglers really fixed a lot of the problems that LNG ended up having because it essentially forced Weiwei to want to scale a bit more, to be a little bit more passive in the early game, and that has completely unlocked LNG. You might look at these numbers: 8th in game duration, 11th in first blood percentage, 11th in first tower percentage. Like, these aren't great numbers, just on paper, but I would argue that these numbers being so low are why LNG is 7-1 in the first place. The fact that they have been taking it a bit slower in the early game, that's kind of what's fixed a lot of their issues. So don't expect this team to blow you away in the first 10 minutes, but this is one of the more clinical team fighting teams in the entire world at the moment, especially with Scout and Gala, who are just superstars in that phase of the game. There really is no other way to say it. If you have a front-to-back fight and Scout and Gala are in it, even Hong, who's really good in that stage, like, there are very few teams in the world that can outskill you in that department. So LNG really finding their niche and their core has really been what's unlocked them, rather than, what you'll read on Reddit, which is just Scout figured out how to play League again. Obviously, that's not just how this works. There were a lot of things that needed to be worked out in terms of approach and communication, and I think they have been. And all that to say, like, Scout's been excellent. He's been one of the best mid laners over the second half of the split. Zika has really started to improve because he's been allowed to have a bit more creative freedom on the top side and not feel like he needs to just kind of protect his jungle and fight over objectives every single time something happens. Gala Zhao and Hong were good all year long, but they are even more unlocked now because as a weak side bot lane, if you will, very similar to the top esports lane, they are allowed to kind of do their own thing for a little while, and they can 2v2 outskill basically anybody in the league. And so LNG has really found a really nice strategy that they can cling on to, and it's made them one of the best teams in the league. Will that carry them, across the finish line to a championship or something like that? I'm really not sure. We're still seeing a lot of people talk about how this team isn't super legit because they do drop a lot of games. They're 14-7, even though they went 7-1. That's a lot of losses. That's a lot of 2-1 series wins, and even against teams like LGD and Ninjas in Pyjamas that really weren't performing well in Group Ascend, they weren't able to convincingly beat. I'm not nearly as concerned as a lot of other analysts. I think they'll do just fine. Do I think that makes them a finals team? I don't really know yet. There are a lot of good teams in the LPL, but I think LNG is going to be a lot more dangerous than certain people are giving them credit for now. But then moving on now to the number 3 seed, and we're going to be talking about 3 and 4 next up. They are not guaranteed to get into the double elimination stage. They would have to win at least one series, but of course, one best of 5 is a lot easier to win than maybe some of the other pathways that we're going to talk about moving forward. But coming in as the number 3 seed, it is going to be Top Esports. This is a great finish for them in comparison to how this stage ended up starting. Group Ascend, I think a lot of people forget, they started 0-2. They came back from the Esports World Cup. They had to play games like 3 days after they got back. They end up going to the finals, obviously, in that tournament halfway across the world. They're forced to come back 3 days later and immediately jump back in to LPL regular season action. Anybody who thinks that kind of scheduling is a good idea is an absolute moron. There's just nothing else I can say in that regard. That was a major mistake. I guess they just didn't expect Top Esports to go very far in that tournament, but they come back and they go 0-2 in their first week, and it's, Panic City. People are starting to worry, okay, well, was that a fluke? Is this team going to be able to recover? The Esports World Cup screwed up a lot of teams. I think it was pretty horribly planned, regardless of what you feel about the event. It was at a horrible time of the year, and Top Esports, I think, suffered the most of any team. Maybe T1, obviously, is another team that really came back and struggled in terms of, finding their form. But after that week, they went 6-0, and not only did they go 6-0, they went 12-0 in terms of their game score. They won all of their final 6 series 2-0, and that is the kind of domination that you are looking for coming into playoffs. I think there is a real lack of conversation surrounding whether or not Top Esports is like a top 3 to 5 team in the world. Like, I think they could be a top 3 team at Worlds this year. They could win Worlds. I think that that's a super realistic thing to potentially expect, and I'll kind of go over why. Their lineup is looking like 369 in the top lane, Tion in the jungle, Cream in the mid lane, Jackie Levitt 80 carry, and Mako at support. Their stats are really interesting. Very low first blood percentage, but pretty high dragon percentage. This should go to show you the changes that Top Esports has made as an org going into this year. What was Top known for a long time? Playing really aggressive, being kind of the ones to push the tempo. You had Jackie Love and Knight, and for a while you had 369 on the top side too, and they were all super aggressive players that wanted to play fast and wanted to look for kills and would flip games and yada yada yada, right? That's not how this team operates anymore. Mako coming in has really adjusted the mentality of, I think, where this team wanted to go. He has clearly become the primary shot caller, and that's been a good thing overall, but it's not just Mako's influence that has slowed this team down and made them more objective-focused. Honestly, Cream coming into the mid lane has really adopted that role. I talked about it a bit in the All-Pro section, but Cream came into this team at the beginning of the year as somebody who had looked incredibly promising as a resource carry, an assassin mid player, someone in the same vein as someone like Zeka over in the LCK, where he plays Akali and LeBlanc and a lot of those other Jace, and a lot of these more aggressive champions isn't somebody that's necessarily going to sacrifice resources for the team. And I was concerned about how that was going to fit in Top Esports because it just didn't feel like that was the style that this team was going to play around. Lo and behold, Cream comes out here in 2024 and is a completely different type of player. He is selfless to a fault at times, where he's giving up resources in the mid lane to make sure Tion is having a very good game in the jungle. He's been a phenomenal team fighter. He's not really making positioning mistakes, which was a big problem for him last year on OMG, even when he was, doing really well. He's just come into Top Esports and, quite frankly, been the most consistent mid laner in the LPL. His growth and quite frankly, his change as a player, the complete transformation that he has done, that's what's unlocked Top Esports to play the way that they have. Tion has obviously benefited the most from it. He's fallen in love with Ivern. Nobody in the LPL was playing Ivern, but Tion has become absolutely addicted to pulling this champion out. That'll probably carry over into the playoffs, but even outside of that, he's great on AP carries. He's great on facilitators. Tion is just an elite level jungle, and especially when you have a mid laner that's so willing going to end up enabling you. That's huge. And, you know, we talked about it with Mako, but the jack of all trades support is perfect for this meta where he can play, you know, engagers. This team plays a lot of Senna Ornn. He can carry on the Ornn in team fights. He can play enchanters if he has to. He can roam. He can stay in lane. He can do a little bit of everything, and that's what makes him valuable. Jackie Love can literally win any game. The only reason that he's getting third team All-Pros because they didn't play through him a lot this year, but if they just suddenly chose to, I wouldn't be surprised. The only concern is 369 in the top lane, as long as he can get back on track, because man, he was really rough in the summer split. There were a lot of games that he just straight up lost in the top lane. Now, it didn't end up impacting top esports all that much, but at the beginning of the split especially, there were real concerns that he was just not going to be the guy he was, even in the spring split. You know, in spring, we were calling him one of the best top laners, if not the best top laner in the world, going into MSI. He just hasn't lived up to that ever since a really bad MSI showing, and he needs to be able to turn that around. If he can do that, this team might be unbeatable. Like, they might be the best team in the LPL at the current moment. I think that there's a very realistic chance that that is the case. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're favorites, but they certainly deserve the conversation a lot more than they're getting right now. And then moving on to our number 4 seed, same position as top esports, but a slightly harder side of the bracket having to go in, you know, if they win into the number 1 seed, Bilibili Gaming. But this team might be uniquely equipped to end up pulling off an upset like that. It's Weibo Gaming coming in as the number 4 seed. And again, similar to LNG, another team that was branded as a fraud and a disappointment all before even half the split was over, and then all of a sudden they turned out to be good and everybody's going to pretend to be surprised. This is always what Weibo was going to do. They had some problems at the beginning of the split that were very real, but very similar to LNG. I don't think it was all that indicative of player skill, at least in everybody's case. There were 2 players that I do think were just playing bad, but things started to get better once this team found a core identity, and let me tell you, that core identity is aggression. That is what they play off of purely, and it's really fun to watch. Their lineup is looking like Breathe in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Xiaohu in the mid lane, Light at AD carry, and Crisp at support. There's really no other way to start this conversation but with Tarzan, because he is the driving force for everything that Weibo wants to do. You had players like Xiaohu and Crisp really underperforming at the beginning of the year. They were really struggling, and, you know, Tarzan was kind of the one that was trying to do things for this team. It wasn't necessarily working. He was trying to get resources, trying to give them to Xiaohu and Crisp and Light and Breathe, and it just wasn't necessarily leading into actual wins for the team. So he said, screw it. I'm going to start being the resource carry. I'm going to play Brand every game. I'm going to play Nidalee every game, and I'm just going to start taking over, and I'm just gonna win. I'm gonna take every objective on the map. I'm not even gonna skirmish. I'm gonna avoid you, but I'm going to be so much like further ahead of you in terms of gold and in terms of pressure on the map that there's literally nothing you can do. You won't want to fight me as the games go on, and that's exactly what Tarzan has done. I think this is an elite level jungle performance, and quite frankly, as I've said before, the only people that are still sitting there and saying like, oh, Tarzan's still bad, you know, this team was still like super dumb to go pick him up, oh, I'm a Tarzan hater, like those, the only people that are still saying that are the people that are just living in the fact that they can't admit that what they said was wrong. Tarzan was amazing for this team, and I expect that to continue. Now, it is fair to call out that he's not been perfect in the playoffs in the past, but that's been very circumstantial. It's really only the year with Doenby in the mid lane where he has struggled in terms of the playoffs, at least in terms of expectations. This is a guy who went to finals last year. I think he's going to be just fine, and he's the best player on this team. That has become clear. And I think the rest of this team is also, like, evened out a little bit. You had players like Xiaohu and Light and even Breathe that were really struggling to carry games at the beginning of the year. That's not the case anymore. Xiaohu has really turned it on. The last couple of weeks have been really solid. Now, at any point, I could honestly see him just completely getting destroyed because he's played quite a few games this year where he's just not been particularly good, but hopefully that doesn't happen too frequently. Light and Crisp are solid. Crisp seems to have, like, woken up after being benched by this team. I think he deserved it, by the way. I'm a huge Crisp fan. I was really on his back last year in, like, a positive way. I was calling him one of the top 5 supports in the world last year, and for the most part, he was. He didn't perform like it at Worlds, but he certainly was the player who got Weibo to Worlds in the first place, and so you feel pretty good about Crisp now that it feels like he's woken up again. Light is Light. Like, if the team is good around him, he's going to be able to perform. He's very consistent in that regard. But if Breathe can really lock in on the top side, if he can be somebody that starts to win more consistently 1v1 again, that's going to be massive. We know he can be a good team fighter in the right circumstances, but the inconsistencies in lane have really haunted him individually as a player, really ever since coming over to RNG. And so hopefully he starts to lock in for Weibo, because if you have a threat on the top and the bot side, and with Tarzan running the game in the jungle, this could be very scary. Now, the problem for Weibo continues to be the fact that on any given day they can win, and on any given given day they can lose against anybody. And so you never really feel good about picking this team to win a series because there's really not a circumstance in which they are definitely going to win. Like, even if they are massive favorites, I'm sure they could lose a best of 5 to RNG on the wrong day right now. You know, it just kind of is the way that Weibo operates. But by that same token, this team could win the LPL. Like, if everything were to go right over and over and over again, it's technically within the realm of possibility for them. I'm certainly going to err on the side of that being definitely a bit of an overreach, but I could see a world in which Weibo kind of surprises some people and maybe ends with an upper tier finish. I'm not going to predict that. Like I said, we'll see in the full bracket prediction. I'm definitely a bit more pessimistic about this team's outlook, but Tarzan's awesome, and even I can't deny that. But now moving down another rung in terms of the playoff seeding, moving to the number 5 and 6 seeds. They are, of course, another round before. The LPL playoffs is structured in a very weird way, but, you know, you'll get it once we start getting into the playoff bracket if you don't already understand how the LPL playoffs work. That means this team, we're firmly in the section of teams that, like, actually have to play their way into potentially being top 4. And that might be a little bit of a surprise for the number 5 seed, JD Gaming, who came in at 4-4. You know, pretty decent showing, I would say, across the entire year, but they certainly didn't end off in the best of circumstances. They are 500 in multiple ways for a reason. This is a really strong team. You know, they're very top heavy. Like, their best players are incredibly talented. They're some of the best in the entire world, as we've talked about, but the problems right now are real. Like, the consistency of this team outside of the good players is actually, like, a real question mark for whether or not they're going to be able to perform at an LPL, like, top 4 caliber level. So we'll go into why those discussions are very real. Their lineup is looking like Sheer in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Yagao in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and missing at support. You know, I can't find it in me to criticize Ruler and Kanavi because they have so much responsibility on this JD Gaming team. I really mean it when I try to emphasize that this team is more 2v8 than anyone in the world. Like, there are bad teams, you know, I think Nongshim comes to mind as a team, or like Invictus Gaming here in the LPL that have 1 or 2 players that are playing really well, but overall they're a really untalented roster that are getting dragged to any kind of success at their level. But there is nothing quite like Kanavi and Ruler being 2 of the best players in the world and having to do what they can with the rest of this team. Now, that's not to say there is no talent. Missing has generally been fine, even if he's been a little bit lackluster. He's kind of just been like a top 10 support instead of a top 5 support or a top 3 support like he was going into the year. Certainly not having the same kind of year he had in 2023. It's the solo lanes that have been the problem. And Sheer, you know, you're hoping he can figure things out and lock things in, at least on the top side. He's relatively inconsistent, but at least at the start of his career, it seemed like he was really stepping up when the moments were the brightest, and that's exactly what you want to see from a young top laner. The problem is, things have definitely gotten worse as he's played more games, which may mean that teams are starting to figure out some of his in-lane tendencies. He might not know matchups nearly as concretely as a lot of other players who have been playing pro for a lot longer, so there are concerns with Sheer, but really my biggest concern is Yagao in the mid lane, and it's not that Yagao sucks and that this player is bad. I know I'm always lower on Yagao with the exception of 2022, where I was calling him a top 10 player in the world because he was at the time. But I know outside of that, I've notoriously been low on Yagao. The problem is, this is like the opposite meta for him to look good. He is a facilitative mid laner that wants to give up resources in order to play for his jungle, but he's in an AD carry meta. He's got to play the Corki, he's got to play the Tristana, he's got to play the Lucian, and quite frankly, he's just not good at these champions. He is like a bottom 10 mid laner in the LPL at these champions. Like, he is not someone that would be competing for an LPL title in terms of how he's able to play out this current meta, and man, it's really affected the rest of this team. Ruler has adapted this like weak side bot lane style that has become super popular. Players like Gala and Jackie Love have really embraced it as well. And you can see that. The Ezreal, the Jhin that I love, and the Ashe. Like, these are good picks for Ruler. Kanavi obviously taking more of a carry role. You're not going to see him on Sejuani. This guy exclusively plays AP carries in the current meta, but all of that ends up crumbling if your mid lane just gets completely run over, which has happened to Yagao. We just watched it happen in the top esports series where Cream just embarrassed him. And that can't happen. Like, Yagao is the kind of player that simply has to be good enough to be able to step up and compete at the top level. If he's not going to be able to do that, JD Gaming's going to be in a bad spot. And if that is the case, that's really sad. This was a team that, you know, won back-to-back LPL titles last year, ended up making a horrific offseason decision, I think at the behest of Kanavi, or at least that's how I'm interpreting it, saying that he wanted to play with Yagao again, that Knight needed to go. Knight goes over to Bilibili. Immediately, they become the best team because Knight is the best player in the LPL. LPL, and, you know, they have to deal with the fact that they're 500, they're 4-4, they're 10-10. They are the definition of mediocrity in Group Ascend, and, you know, to say that about JDG is definitely strange, but they have the firepower, they have the talent to be able to dig themselves out of this hole. We just need to see them be able to do it, and I'm gonna be honest, if they do it off the back of anybody not named Kanavi and Ruler, I'm gonna be genuinely stunned. But then moving on to our number 6 seed, and this is a team I've been waiting to talk about, one that I'm notoriously high on, one that I think, you know, is an org that I've given a lot of credit in the past, regardless of whether or not they have earned it. It's anyone's Legend, and I'm finally excited to be able to talk about them in a playoff context. It feels like every single year I mentioned AL as a team that should be a playoff team, that is going to be a surprise contender. I did it in spring, I did it last year, you know, I'm a big fan of Zhao Hao, and, you know, I've been talking about it for a while, and finally it feels like they put together a roster that can actually achieve the upside that it looks like they have on paper, which is really exciting. The problem is it doesn't feel like they're in the best form going into the playoffs. I think they started to get a bit more exposed than they were in Group D in the second half of the year in Group Ascend, and hopefully they can fix some of the problems that they've been running into. I'll explain where I think things are going wrong and why I think they could actually surprise some teams that are just straight up better than them if things end up going right. Their lineup is looking like Ole in the top lane, Krako in the jungle, Shanks in the mid lane, Hope at AD carry, and Kale at support. This is obviously a ridiculously talented team in terms of roster construction. This is the best team AL has ever put together. You've got multiple people who have not only been to Worlds before, but have performed well. Ale, obviously a former world champion. You have someone in Hope who's a former world semifinalist. You have players in Krako and Kale that have performed incredibly well as teammates in the past over in the LCK. And then, of course, Shanks, who is one of the best up-and-coming young mid laners in the entire region. This should be a roster that ends up competing at the top of the standings. Now, for a while, that was definitely the case. They started off Group Ascend 3-0, and they looked awesome. They got all their easy games out of the way at the beginning, but then the hard games started piling in. A lot of the other top teams started piling in on their schedule, and they couldn't quite hold up. They end the Group Ascend at 3-5, 5 losses in a row. It's really not an ideal place for them to land, and the 6th seed isn't really great, but, you know, in comparison to what AL is probably used to, I'm sure they're going to live with it. At the end of the day, the best way I can describe this team is chaos. That's how they like to play the game. When you're looking for the team that's going to forego objectives and forego, you know, trying to dominate 2v2 and be clinical and strategical about their game plan and just try to outskill you, that's anyone's Legend, or at least that's what they've been over the course of this split. A lot of that is spearheaded by Krako and Shanks in the middle of the map. Both of them kind of have that mentality. Krako in particular has always been a player that's been a lot more willing to just try and, you know, flip things 50-50, try and see if he's better than you. And if it works great. And if it doesn't work, it works horrible. Krako has definitely kind of been an influence on the team in that regard, but Shanks is kind of the through point for AL. When he is playing well, this team just wins. They are able to beat teams that are just straight up better than them in context that you wouldn't normally expect. But the problem for Shanks is that his best performances are so good that when he so consistently doesn't have those, you start to get concerned, and that's kind of just become the reality. And the real concern for Shanks is that the pattern has continued over the course of not only this year, but, you know, this split in particular, where he starts off so hot and he looks so good at the beginning of the split, and then by the time you at the end of the split, it's like, well, where did that Shanks from the first half go? Like, what happened to him? Where did the consistency go? And that's unfortunately the case once again here. It's happened every single split of his career. He's got to figure out his form going into playoffs. I'm not exactly sure whether I believe he will or won't be able to do that, because it's kind of strange to try and assess whether or not a player is actually going to be able to unlock the full version of himself. But if he's out there and like actively dominating this mid lane matchup and is able to roam a lot with Krako and create these big skirmish situations that they thrive in, that's massive for AL. They can beat teams that are a lot better than them in those circumstances. The problem is if that's not working, there's really no backup plan here. Ale is kind of the backup plan. He's the best team fighter this team has, and I don't even think it's particularly close. He is a great macro player if you want him to split push. He can do that basically better than anybody in the league. That's what he does. Great 1v1 player. He can duel really well. You know what you're getting with Ale, and there are going to be games where he looks great, but top lane is way too volatile in the current meta right now. You can't really rely on it on a game-to-game carry. If you get good matchups, it looks great. If you get bad matchups, it doesn't look super ideal, and so Ale's going to be useful, but you can't really rely on him to be the guy. Hope and Kale are also definitely not that kind of bot lane. Like, they are not strong side bot. That is not how they want to play the game. Hope has never really been that for any of the teams that he's played for. He is kind of the quintessential weak side bot laner. I'm not really all that that high on Hope. I think he is probably the worst player on this team and might be a weak link that ends up holding them back a bit. I really have just never seen it in him in terms of the mechanics in comparison to the players that he's going to have to be as good as. Like, yeah, he is an upper half, AD carry at this level. He is certainly somebody who deserves to be like a top 6 or top 7, AD carry in terms of spot, but you're not playing other AD carries that are around that level. You're going to have to play, some pretty good, damn good players, we'll just say, going into the next round, and I just don't know if Hope is the kind of player that can hold up in those environments. I like Kale a lot, but he's also a lot more one-dimensional. He is a roamer. He is somebody who wants to play Leona and Nautilus and these engage threats. He really doesn't do a lot else. He is definitely a lot more of a, I want to be around the map, I want to try to affect things macro-wise rather than, trying to focus on the 2v2, and that really highlights the fact that this team is very one-dimensional. Now, that dimension can be incredibly difficult to stop if they are playing well, but if that dimension isn't working, they don't really have anything that they can pivot to, which is why they've ended up losing a lot of games. I think this team will be scary, but I really just don't know if the upside is there from a consistency standpoint to see this team get anywhere near top 4. But then moving on to our final team that does not have a confirmed first-round opponent just yet. It's going to be the number 7 seed. They start in technically round 1 of the playoffs. They will play the lowest ranked team to come out of the play-in stage, which we will obviously talk about in just a moment. It's going to be FunPlus Phoenix coming in as the number 7 seed, and this is exactly where they probably should have landed. This is a very, very predictable team. They have everything we said about AL just a couple of moments ago, it applies to FPX, but like tenfold. This team is very predictable, one play style, not flexible. But if that playstyle ends up working for them in the early game, they are going to be able to run things over, and they have the talent to do so. They're just not quite as well-rounded. I think a lot of the super big excitement kind of stops here. I don't think FPX is ever going to be a top 4 team. I would just be generally very surprised if they end up making it there, but they have a couple of things that could make them some surprise candidate, kind of an upset candidate, if you will, as we go throughout the playoffs. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like ZDZ in the top lane, Milky Way in the jungle, Care in the mid lane, Dectum at AD carry, and Life at support. There are okay players on this team. I'm really not a fan of the solo laners. I'm going to start there just because I think it's, I want to make it clear, I think Care is one of the weaker mid laners in all of the playoffs. I was really in on Care last year, but man, he has had a really bad 2024. He's just looked not good. I think it's been better, obviously, in the back half of summer. That's kind of the encouraging part, as things seem to have equalized out, but in a way where he's just kind of become a league average mid laner, he's not trending upward from what he was in 2023, which is a bit concerning. I honestly think he's been worse all the time across this year. He was awful in spring for this team, even with them playing well. And ZDZ is certainly not a star on the top lane. The second RNG player to miraculously get plucked out and become a playoff player. It's very funny how that's ended up working out for a lot of them, but ZDZ is kind of a big nothing burger on the top side. I'm not even sure he's better than Zhao Lao, who I've been saying they're basically the same player the entire time. I think that's the case. I still don't know why they made this decision. It was very strange. Maybe they just didn't want all the off-the-riff drama that Zhao Lao, who obviously created. Not that it was his fault. Pro player in this instance, and anti the organization in terms of all the drama that went down for Zhao Lao, but maybe they just didn't want the headache of all of the noise surrounding it, and they ended up wanting to go to ZDZ instead. I don't know, but either way, he's not a needle mover. It's all really going to be about jungle and the bot lane here, and mostly jungle. I mean, you look at these stats, it's very clear what this team does. If Milky Way gets an early lead, it's over. Second in first blood percentage in the LPL. That's any stage. That's Group Ascend, that's Group Nirvana. They're second in the LPL in first blood percentage. This team plays fast and, crazy early on. And if Milky Way is able to start snowballing, he's so mechanically talented that it's almost impossible to be able to shut him down. Even good teams have fallen to Milky Way over the course of this year, just purely from him having too much gold to be able to deal with. But he's really not a great player at playing from neutral. We talked about it a bit earlier. When he gets those leads, he's dominant. He's not an elite level player at having to play out typical game states front to back 5v5s. He's not really a facilitator in any way. He's not going to make the rest of his team have an easier job. He's just kind of a resource carry player that you're hoping gets ahead. That's been FPX's strategy all year. Now, they do have kind of a backup plan in the form of Dectum, however much you want to put stock into that. Dectum, I think, can win games for you. I'm not sure if he can do it at like a super high level. I don't know if he can be like a top 5 or top 6 AD carry at this level, but he can be somewhere in the middle of the pack, and I think that's going to be good enough for this team. Most of the time, you're looking for Dectum and Life to just win 2v2, which is something they don't do super often. They've been better at it in summer, but they're not very good in lane. Just survive and get to the point in the mid to late game where they can be, you know, really big secondary carries for this team. Life oftentimes either on an engager or on his, you know, notable Rumble support pick that he's kind of popularized over the course of this year, and then decked him, of course, on whatever flavor of the month kind of utility AD carry he wants to end up playing. But Milky Way is the guy for this team. He's either going to carry them across the finish line, or it's all going to come crashing and burning down around them. Funnily enough, I think this is the exact same team that they were in spring. I just think the LPL is better now, and so they end up falling down to number 7. I don't really expect them to go super far. In fact, I'm not even sure they are going to make it out of the first round, depending on who they end up running into, but, you know, we'll end up seeing. This team is certainly not a throwaway roster. I think that there are upsides, but the downsides are real too. But that's going to do it for all the teams that have locked themselves into the playoffs, or at least the playoffs proper. It's time to get into our play-in series. There's going to be 3 of these to cover. I'm going to be going over what you can expect in terms of matchup from all 3 of these series. We'll, of course, be going over the 2 teams in each series, but I won't be doing predictions now. That will be for the end of the video when we do the full bracket, but you'll at least get a pretty good idea of where I stand on a lot of these play-in series by the end. If you are unfamiliar with how play-ins kind of works here in the LPL, the bottom 2 teams from Group Ascend end up in a pool with the top 4 teams from Group Nirvana, and they end up playing, you know, 3 different best of 5s in order to determine the 3 final teams to end up making it. So the top team, you know, that's in the pool is seed 8 from Group Ascend, and the bottom team is seed 4 from Group Nirvana, etc., and then it just pairs up like that. So that's going to be the series we take a look at first. The number 8 seed from Group Ascend, LGD Gaming, taking on the number 4 seed from Group Nirvana, Invictus Gaming. And boy, is this a playoff matchup. It is wild to see these 2 teams playing for a chance to get in. One of these teams is a playoff team, and that does not feel like that should be right. Both of them have major issues, and both of them had incredibly low expectations going not only into the split, but into the year as a whole, and both of them, I think, have overperformed it to some extent. The records definitely look a bit strange. LGD's looks awful because they were in Group Ascend and had to play the best teams over and over again. Invictus's looks way better than you would expect because they got to play a lot of the teams that were really struggling down the stretch, and so, you know, the records definitely aren't indicative. One thing that I think is funny because of the way the format works, these 2 teams have not yet played each other this split. They are 0-0. Typically speaking, when we talk about these playoff series previews, I would talk about, oh, you know, what do I think is going to happen, you know, based off of what the last time these 2 teams played? Well, they haven't played, so I don't really know. So I'll have to give you my analysis based off of just how I think these 2 teams would match up on paper, but let's go ahead and talk about it. LGD's roster is, of course, Bertle in the top lane, Meteor in the jungle, Hai Chao in the mid lane, Xiaoya at AD carry, and Jin Zhao at support. I believe it's going to be Xiaoya. If it is Kepler, if it somehow ends up being Kepler, I'll just lose my mind and die, I guess. There's really nothing else for me to do at this point other than to try to warn people that Kepler is completely unplayable at an LPL level. Xiaoya is the only option here for LGD, but, you know, we'll see. I think this is going to be their starting 5, but for Invictus on the other side, their lineup is looking like You Should Know Me in the top lane, GLFS in the jungle, Nenny in the mid lane, On at AD carry, and Vampire at support. The first thing that jumps out to me about this matchup is that you have probably the 2 single lowest grading players from the summer split in this matchup. Jin Zhao for LGD, Vampire for Invictus Gaming. Pretty crazy that they're going to go head-to-head, and it's even crazier that one of them is going to make the playoffs considering how they played. Jin Zhao, I think, is probably the better player. He was really struggling in Group Ascend, but I think generally if he was in Group Nirvana, he probably would have looked like an okay support at that level, but the fact that he was having to go up against some of the best teams in the LPL over and over and over again, it just kind of exposed how not good he was. But Vampire was struggling against Group Nirvana supports, and so that's a bit more of a concern. I will say he actually had a lot more positive moments at the end of summer than he ever did in spring, or really even at the beginning of summer, and so there is like upward trajectory when it comes to Vampire. I'm just not really all that confident in his individual mechanics and his decisions and really just his general support play, and so I just wanted to point that out at the start. But we're going to go lane by lane, and I'll kind of give you an idea of where I think the strengths and weaknesses are for these teams in comparison to each other. I think when you're looking at what LGD can do to win, it's the top side of the map. It's top, it's jungle, it's mid, and specifically it's mid jungle that I think could really take over the series. Not only is that the cornerstone for LGD Gaming, but That's kind of where Invictus Gaming struggles the most. GLFS has not been hyper consistent, although he is another player that has just straight up been better in the recent weeks than he was at the beginning of the year. That's really good. Nenny is certainly not like a super exciting mid laner. He doesn't typically lose super hard. He's one of the few players on this team that tries to play a little bit more of a controlled style, but he's not mechanically talented enough to be able to really dominate games. And that's where I think Meteor and Haichao can really start to separate themselves. Haichao is an unbelievably good mid laner. Honestly, I considered him for All-Pro. He was like in the conversation for me simply because of how valuable he was to LGD Gaming. I don't think he's a top 3 mid laner in the LPL, but I don't know if there was if there were 3 to 4 or 5 mid laners that were more valuable to their team's success than Haichao. He just continues to drag this team across the finish line. And for somebody that I was talking about at the beginning of the year as someone I had given up on because he had just never proven it at the LPL level after multiple opportunities for this to be his big breakout year, I'm really excited to be wrong on that front. Haichao is a really fun player to watch. But Meteor is also somebody that can be really effective. He is obviously the kind of player that is a little bit more dependent on his specific champions, the Kindred, the Graves. These are things that you're often going to see banned out against him. Marksman in the jungle are definitely more of his forte, with Marksman kind of being popular in the mid lane right now. He has transitioned into the AP junglers, most notably the Brand and the Lilia, at least from my memory. And he's been good. Honestly, I expected him to be really bad in this meta, and he hasn't been. And so jungle mid is definitely kind of the big plus for LGD. I also think top lane is in their favor. Bertle should just be better than You Should Know Me. You Should Know Me has been entirely uninspiring so far. In summer, he came back in, and people were like, oh, finally, we get to see him play again. And he has been like a complete nothing on the top side of the map for them ever since he came back. And so I'm really not expecting anything from You Should Know Me, and Bertle is the more talented player. So I would expect him to be able to make do there. But the top side of the map isn't the only part of the map. I do think bot lane is in favor of Invictus. If you're looking at a way that IG can end up winning this series, not only has LGD's biggest weakness always been their bot lane, they've just not been able to settle and find anyone that can stay consistent in that role, but Invictus has one of the hardest carries in the entire league in On. On is a ridiculously good player. I talked about it in the All-Pro segment. He's like number 4 or number 5 in terms of AD carries in my rankings. Like, he graded out as an All-Pro caliber AD carry. I just couldn't justify leaving any of the people that were, on the list off of it. I couldn't justify putting him above Jackie Love for 3rd team, even if there is a really strong argument that he added more value to Invictus than Jackie Love did to Top Esports. It's a pretty crazy thing to say, but On is just elo held into oblivion. This is a guy who should be playing for a top 5 or 6 or 7 team that we've already talked about in this video, and yet here he is stuck on a team that's just barely qualifying out of Group Nirvana. Like, On is ridiculous. If you want an AD carry at the lower end of the standings that might not cost all that much, On is the guy that you should go pick up next year if you're an LPL team. This dude is a menace, and quite frankly, he can individually be the best player on the Rift in this series. I think that that's a very believable thing. Him and Haichao are definitely going to trade that off, I think, but if On ends up showing up and is the best player in both of these series, Invictus has a real shot to be able to win this. If he can just hard carry these games coming out of the bot lane, especially because LGD's bot lane is so bad in the 2v2, like, there is a real opportunity for him to get so many resources in the early game that he just dominates. I think LGD's bot lane is a bigger weakness than, like, Invictus's mid lane, and that's the concerning part, right? Is you just don't want your bad lane to lose as bad as the other team's bad lane. Like, that's the only thing that you can kind of hold your hat on. So if On and Vampire or On mostly can just destroy Xiaoya and Jin Zhao and really farm them for gold, perhaps he can carry this series. I just don't have a lot of faith in the rest of this team. And I've already talked about Vampire being a bit of a problem for me. That's not really going to change. GLFS, I think, has been making some really good strides in the recent weeks. I think he has been improving very steadily, and I've been very interested in his progress. Meteor is definitely a tough challenge, but he might be up for it. I'm interested to see the game plan that they end up having. The good thing about Nenny is if he's your weak link, he doesn't lose very hard. Again, he doesn't give over a ton of those resources, which is what I talked about. If Xiaoya is losing harder than Nenny is, that's probably a good thing for Invictus. And then You Should Know Me is very talented. He's just not really shown it. It hasn't really felt like he's been locked in at all over the course of this split. He's honestly regressed a ton from what he was even in the spring. So, I am a bit concerned about the overall general vibe of Invictus, but they have avenues to end up winning the series. LGD is certainly not your typical, like, group ascend team that you have to go up facing, either that is, like, really strong on paper and just underperforming, or is like just an okay team that wasn't quite good enough for the upper tier. They're like a genuine Group Nirvana team on paper. And so, Invictus has a really rare opportunity to be a team that everybody was laughing at that should have never really been in this spot in the first place had other teams actually lived up to expectations that might still end up making the playoffs proper. And then moving on to our second of the play-in series that I'm going to cover. It's the second of the Group Ascend versus Group Nirvana matchups. It's the last place team from Group Ascend in Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on the third seed from Group Nirvana in Rare Atom. Now, this is a very weird situation because on paper, Ninjas in Pyjamas is definitely the better of these two teams, but man, they have just been an utter disaster ever since getting into Group Ascend. They looked pretty good in Group D in the qualification stage. They just couldn't carry that over at all into the actual main stage. On the flip side, Rare Atom has actually looked really good, and as I said in my final week review, my week 5 review that went up a couple of days ago, I think yesterday actually, as this video is going out, they might have had a tactical loss at the end of the split in order to get this number 3 spot. Seeds 1 and 2 have to play each other from Group Nirvana, and those are teams with some good momentum. Rare Atom now gets to play the single worst team from Group Ascend that couldn't win a single series. This might not really be all that bad for them in the long run. Let's talk about it. Ninjas in Pyjamas lineup is looking like Shanji in the top lane, Leon, I believe, in the jungle, Rookie in the mid lane, Photic at AD carry, and Juo at support. Leon was obviously recently signed by Ninjas in Pyjamas. He only played one series before the end of the regular season, but he was awful in that series. That is certainly something worth noting. He got completely run over in all 3 of the games, even their win. Shanji was just as bad, but Leon was horrible. They still have Aki on roster if they do want to end up playing him, but I imagine it will be Leon moving forward. And for Rare Atom, their lineup is looking like Xiaoshu in the top lane, Xiao Hao in the jungle, Vikla in the mid lane, Assume at AD carry, and Jue at support. This is a really intriguing matchup because when you look at the strengths and weaknesses on paper, Ninjas in Pyjamas should kind of run things in terms of how things end up going, but the inconsistencies of these players have led to this discussion and this discourse being a lot more variable than maybe you would anticipate. Really, the only lane that I can look at and be like, you gotta be better is mid lane. Rookie has to be better than Vikla. If Rookie is not better than Vikla, the series is already over. If Vikla can step up and win for Rare Atom, that is the nail in the coffin for Ninjas in Pyjamas, because regardless of what happens with the rest of this team, they have already proven one thing, and that's that Rookie is the center of every decision that they will make for the rest of the year. Regardless of how well Photic, Juo, Shanji, Leon play, this team doesn't know how to play if Rookie is losing. And so if Rookie ends up losing to Vikla, that's a disaster for Ninjas in Pyjamas, but that's really the only lane I can look at and say, I feel very confident that that is like a Rookie-favored matchup, at least in terms of what I've seen over the course of this year. Rookie has been pretty, variable in terms of what he's offered in the mid lane, especially in Group Ascend, but I think Vikla is not the kind of competition that you would necessarily expect to destroy Rookie. Now, Vikla can be really good. Obviously, he's had a lot of success in the past before coming to the LPL, but what I think a lot of people have kind of been sleeping on is that he's been really good this summer for Rare Atom. I know there's been some up and down games. In particular, you can probably point to 2 or 3 games, but series-wide, he has been very good for Rare Atom. He's graded out incredibly well statistically for this team, and I think a lot of that shows on tape. He has honestly just played way better in summer than he did in spring, where he was really struggling to adapt and adjust. He was one of the weaker players in the entire league. He has been a lot better so far in the summer split. If he can just be good in this lane, that might be enough for Rare Atom to win just on its own, because again, Rookie out of the game is kind of a death sentence for Ninjas in Pyjamas, but every other lane is a lot more interesting. We'll start with the top lane, Shanji versus Xiaoshu. This should be Shanji favored, in every conceivable way you would expect that, but Shanji has been nothing but a disaster so far in 2024. It's the worst year of his career, and it's not even remotely close. This was somebody that I was going into the year saying he's easily in that top 3 cluster with the other best top laners, with 369 and Bin. It was 369, Bin, and Shanji. They were the 3 best top laners in the LPL for me going into 2024, and everything has collapsed around him. He has been an utter disaster for this team. He was awful in spring. He's been awful in summer. There's just really not a lot of redeeming games from Shanji, and even when there are redeeming games, he often follows those up with awful performances later on in the same exact series. There's just not really a lot to look at and say, I feel good about this. That being said, Xiaoshu has also not been particularly good over the course of this split. I told you guys, top lane in the LPL, it's just not very good right now, and Xiaoshu's another example of that. He's got crazy upside. We've been talking about it for a while. I really praised Rare Atom for going out and getting him in the middle of the split last year, because he's just kind of a difference-making type of prospect. If he were to grow and develop into what we think he could be, that could be a real game changer for Rare Atom, but it's just not really happened. His 2024 sophomore slump has been very real. He has really not been a strength for this team. And I think you can have a similar story here about bot lane, although I think a little bit less so. Like, Asum and Jway, they're probably the better bot lane right now. Photic and Zhuo have been an absolute disaster. This is coming off of 2023, where I said they were the weakest lane in the entire LPL, where I said that Photic individually was the most harmful player to his own team's success in the entire LPL. If there's anybody in the history of this channel that I have been notoriously low on, it's Photic. Going back to 2022 Victory 5, when I said he was mega overrated and was getting way too much credit for what he was doing on that team, to me saying that he was the worst player in the LPL last year. Like, I'm not going to try and sit here and pretend that I'm not biased against Photic in terms of what I've seen, but it's not coming from a place of I want him to fail. It's coming from, it's hard for me not to watch the tape and see anything other than a player that just doesn't really do anything, that is bad mechanically and, you know, has some interesting decision-making decisions that end up putting him in bad situations. Like, I just don't see a really good LPL caliber AD carry there, and I think that has been exposed every single time that he's been put in big situations. And it's not like Zhuo is the type of support that will make that easier or better for him. This is not a strong bot lane. That being said, Asum and Jway are also not stars to me. Asum is like the definition of a good AD carry at this level. He's not somebody that's going to elevate like a really good team. You wouldn't want him if you were a top 5 or a top 6 team, but someone on like a Rare Atom, that's a perfect spot for him, where he can be a difference maker, where he can actually start to affect whether or not they can win games. And quite frankly, he is better than Photic. And so I would expect this to go in favor of Rare Atom. Now, is Jway better than Zhuo? Jway is super variable. His wins are great. His losses are bad. He's just that kind of engaged support that's going to go in all the time. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes he's a bit disconnected from the rest of this team. I still would expect Rare Atom to have the better bot lane here, and I really would expect them to have the better jungler. That's where I think this kind of just blows wide open. Hopefully Leon can figure something out. That first series was a bit of a disaster from him in terms of, you know, what he offered Ninjas in Pyjamas, but Xiao Hao is like a genuine difference maker. This was a guy that was on an upper tier team just last split in Weibo Gaming. He obviously got dropped for Tarzan. That has turned out to be pretty good for Weibo, but Xiao Hao has had his traditional summer breakout. He does this literally every single year. You know, we can talk about Xiao Hao being kind of this inconsistent player gameplay-wise. He has been super consistent in terms of the trends that he has had. 2022 summer, he was in my All-Pro team. 2023 summer, he was in my All-Pro team. He wasn't in my All-Pro team this split because of the way that the groups ended up working out, but he was close. Like, he certainly was the jungler in Group Nirvana that I was considering. Xiao Hao is a huge difference maker, somebody who I think could genuinely make top 4 on a team if everything were to go right. He is good enough to do that as a carry, and I think he's going to massacre Leon in this matchup. I just do not see, you know, a situation where Leon just ends up being way better. You know, I say that, but Leon always has these weird, crazy performances when you would least expect it. So we'll see, but if you haven't noticed, I'm pretty high on Rare Atom, and I'm like in the negatives on Ninjas in Pyjamas right now. I mean, 0-8 will do that to you. I still think there is a very reasonable chance that NIP could walk out of this with a win because, again, Rookie could be the best player on the Rift, but if he's not, that could be a big problem for the upper seed. But that's going to bring us to our final play-in series to cover here, and it's the battle between the two top teams in Group Nirvana. Only one of them can end up making the playoffs. It's OMG taking on Thunder Talk Gaming. And we'll see how this ends up going. I think this could be a really intriguing matchup for both teams. I think both could be considered favorites for different reasons. It's all just really about how much, you know, effort and how much trust you put into a core group of players, because I honestly think these two teams are incredibly similar. You both have very experienced, kind of carry-oriented mid laners. Angel not necessarily known for his carry-oriented style, but has certainly picked it up in the recent years. You have junglers with low expectations that came into this split and overperformed heavily. Top laners who have not really been able to get it together over the course of their career, but have started to figure things out over specifically the last week or two. And then two bot lanes that are relatively young, specifically two AD carries that are kind of young and up and coming, that you're hoping can make a big splash on the playoff stage. It's ridiculous how similar these two teams are, and I think the interesting thing is that these are two teams that have played against each other this split because they were both in Group Nirvana. Thunder Talk took that series 2-0, and what I ended up taking away from that series was there are real ways to exploit the way that OMG currently plays, and if you've got the talent, you can shut down a lot of the things that are going wrong for OMG. Now, that required a step up from a player that has not been super consistent in Feather, which we will talk about, but, you know, we'll get into all of that. We'll talk about all of the matchups in just a second. Each lineup we should get into now. For OMG, their lineup is looking like Harry in the top lane, Tianjin in the jungle, Angel in the mid lane, Starry at AD carry, and PP God at support. For Thunder Talk, their lineup is looking like Hoya in the top lane, Beishuan in the jungle, Yukal UCal in the mid lane, 1xN at AD carry, and Feather at support. These are both, again, very similar teams. What ended up happening when these two teams played off last time is that Tianjin got a bit exposed. He got a little bit overzealous in the early game, and it was really the only series where he was shut down a lot in the mid game, where he was constantly getting caught out, where he was being put in bad positions, and if that can happen again, that is an instant loss for OMG, because they rely a lot on the pressure that Tianjin has been able to generate for them. Him coming into this team midway through the split reinvigorated them in ways that I was not anticipating. As somebody who has historically been very low on Tianjin as a player, I was shocked to see him come in and be so good at Sejuani and Vi and a lot of these facilitators early because of the aggressive tendencies, but it's really worked out. If ThunderTalk can keep that magic going, specifically off the back of this bot lane being incredibly strong, that's going to be GG, because I think they have enough talent around the rest of this roster to capitalize on being able to shut down Tianjin. The key matchup is obviously Angel versus UCal. This is probably the most interesting matchup of the entire play-in stage. This is ridiculous that we are getting it here. Both of these players are so good. I'm slightly going to favor UCal in this matchup, if only for the mechanical, prowess that he has shown in years past. But Angel is a ridiculously good player, and man, you cannot count him out. Angel is one of those players that has just reliably been able to win games for so many teams, and he's been able to switch up his style. He's been that facilitator in the World Finals for Suning. He's been the hyper carry for Ninjas in Pyjamas last year. He's kind of a middle, cross of the two right now here for OMG, but he's just a player that I don't want to downplay him. I think he's really good. I just think UCal is also ridiculously good, and he fits this AD carry mid meta incredibly well. It's why this team has gone on such a run so far in Group Nirvana, but I just wanted to point that one out first because it's really fun. Bot lane, I think, is really going to be the lane that kind of dictates who wins this series, if you will. If 1xN and Feather are really able to step up, if 1xN can have a really good series, if Feather can get out on the map and be super consistent and, actually make a lot of those aggressive plays that he goes for work, which has sometimes been a problem for him, that's going to be massive, because the big issue with Feather is that he is always looking to engage, regardless of whether his team is in a position to follow up on it or not. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. We're going to have to see how that ends up playing out, but Starry and PPGod have been a massive anchor for OMG. Starry has stepped up and been one of the best rookies in the LPL. He ended up finishing second in my Rookie of the Split voting. He has really impressed me. His tape is really good so far in Group Nirvana, and if he's going to be able to maintain that, that's huge for OMG. If PPGod can, just maintain where he's at now, obviously he's not the PPGod that he was last year. He's not the PPGod he was on Victory 5. He's just kind of been an average support for this team, but that's good enough. Starry has been an above-average bot laner so far in the summer split. If you're getting that, that's better than what 1xN and Feather are offering on the other side. Then you've got the jungle matchup, Tianjin versus Beishuan. Tianjin just can't lose as hard as he did the last time these two teams played against each other. Again, Feather and Beishuan kind of made his life a living hell. They were constantly trying to skirmish with him early, not really allowing him to do the things that he would like to do to get in his comfort zone, and it really threw him off his game. Even the comfort pick of Rengar could not help him, and so it ended up being a bit of a problem. If Beishuan can continue to do that, and there's reason to believe he can, as somebody who, as a player, his MO is that he's really not all that mechanically talented, but he is incredibly smart, great shot caller, really good macro. If he can lock in on that front and really start to, tear apart Tianjin and take advantage of some of his weaknesses, that's a surefire way to shut down OMG, and I think Beishuan has been more consistent, but Tianjin's highs are way higher than Beishuan. If Tianjin can get going, he could still run this series and, quite frankly, take advantage of Beishuan's lack of mechanical prowess to be able to kind of stop him in the mid game. So we'll end up seeing how that matchup ends up going. Top lane, I don't think will matter at all. Both of these guys have been horrendous for the most part over the course of their LPL careers. Hoya has probably been worse. Harry's just been a guy, even though I think he's lost a lot more than people give him credit for. But both of them have been better in the last 2 weeks. Hoya's probably been better in the last 2 weeks as well. So, we'll see how this ends up going. I don't really think top lane's going to matter at all here. This is going to be about jungle, and this is going to be about bot lane. As much as I do think the mid laners are the core of both of these teams, they're so much of the core, and they're both so good that I don't think either is going to give over a huge lead to the other. But if 1xN or Starry can get super fed, if Feather or PPGod can get out on the map, and if Tianjin or Beishuan falls really far behind, if one of those things ends up happening, that's likely going to dictate a game or an entire series for both of these teams. And so I'm really happy to see this. This is probably the most evenly matched play-in series that we're going to get. All right, but that is going to do it for all the individual analysis of all of the teams, all of the matchups. It's time to get into what you guys were waiting for, the full bracket prediction. I'm excited to go over this. I'm gonna probably try and go through this quickly because as you can see, there's a billion teams, 13 teams in the playoffs for the LPL. I gotta get through this as quickly as possible, so it might be a bit like shorter sections than maybe you're used to from some of the other regions, but I am going to try to fly through these, so let's get into it, starting, of course, with the play-ins, starting with LGD Gaming taking on Invictus. If you couldn't tell, I actually think this is a pretty close matchup from my preview, but I am slightly leaning in favor of LGD Gaming right now. I do think that they will be able to pick up the win through Haichao and Meteor. I think that's just a more reliable way for them to win over On. I think this is the only matchup that LGD could have pulled from the teams that ended up making it out of Group Nirvana that they would end up winning. I do not think they would end up winning against basically anyone else, but Invictus is just not a team that I really trust in right now, and I have them going out in the play-ins because of that. So LGD somehow, someway does end up making the playoffs after their confidence win against Ninjas in Pyjamas. And speaking of Ninjas in Pyjamas, they are facing Rare Atom in the next play-in series, and I do not have them moving on. Rare Atom is going to be picking up the win for me. That should have been obvious from my preview. I actually think this is the most lopsided of the play-in series. That being said, Ninjas in Pyjamas is now going to come out and just straight up win, and I'm going to look like an idiot, and we're going to have to live with that, but at least for now, I feel like Rare Atom is the one I feel most comfortable winning any of these series, and I really do feel like they're the better team. Most specifically, I feel like Xiao Hao is going to be the best player in that series, and I think he will make a difference. So I have Rare Atom moving on, and then OMG taking on Thunder Talk, again, probably the closest of these series. I just narrowly have OMG moving on. I just think they've been slightly more consistent in terms of Group Nirvana. Thunder Talk have had some good days, some bad days. Maybe they'll show up here. I just don't think I can predict that. I'm going to have OMG moving on, although I do think this is a great spot for both of them to be in if Rare Atom does end up winning, because as you can see, the way the bracket ends up working out, the lowest seed from play-ins ends up going down to face FPX. The other two play each other, which means on the top side of the bracket, we've now got LGD versus OMG, and I've got OMG winning this. LGD is not the kind of team that I think can go blow for blow with Angel and Starry and Tianjin. I just don't know if they have the firepower to do that. I think bot lane in particular is going to be a big problem for them in that series, so I have OMG moving on. I would have Thunder Talk moving on as well. I think LGD is weaker than both of those teams, and so OMG going to be moving on after winning through the play-ins. That's pretty cool. And then FPX taking on Rare Atom on the bottom side of the bracket. I'm doing it. I'm picking Rare Atom. This feels crazy, but I'm going to do it. I really don't feel like FPX matches up particularly well into Rare Atom. When you think about how FPX wins, its early advantages through Milky Way. Well, Rare Atom's one of the only teams in Group Nirvana that actually has a jungler that is just going to shut a lot of that down. In Xiao Hao, at least my guess would be that he could shut it down. Now, if I'm wrong about this, I'm not going to be shocked. Like, Milky Way is a really, really talented player, and I think that there is a real chance that they just sweep through this series, and they're a lot more talented than I'm giving them credit for. But for now, I actually really do value Rare Atom, and I've said that before, and I've almost always gotten burned by it. We'll see if Rare Atom finally comes up for me in terms of these predictions, but I have them moving on to round number 2. And speaking of round 2, OMG taking on JD Gaming, and I'm gonna do it. I'm picking it. JD Gaming's moving on. I mean, come on, like... No, are we kidding here? I'm not crazy. I'm not going that far, right? OMG is not a good enough team to take down JD Gaming. That would be absolutely insane. I hope that it's a fun series, but Kanavi and Ruler are going to tear apart Tianjin and Starry. Those are players who have done a really good job of overperforming and, you know, putting themselves in good positions in comparison to expectations. That run ends here. JD Gaming is going to get by them very easily. And then we have a really fun matchup on paper. It's Anyone's Legend taking on Rare Atom. And the reason this is fun is Xiao Hao versus his former team. And, you know, you're really hoping that he can get one over. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think AL's a little bit more well-rounded, although Xiao Hao, he might, I don't know, like Krako's known to some bad performances. Would it be crazy to see RA win this series and go to round number 3? I don't think it's the most insane thing in the entire world. I certainly think FPX is a team that would have a shot here as well. Milky Way, you know, absolutely could get advantages against players like Krako. I just don't know if I'm going to predict that. I think AL, like I said, is more well-rounded, and that's going to get them to move on. I think Ole could have a field day going up against Xiaoshu if everything ends up going right for them. But then we really start to get into the nitty-gritty, the top 6 here, and the last series to determine who ends up getting into the double elimination stage of the LPL bracket. It's JD Gaming versus Weibo on the top side, and I've got JD Gaming picking up the win. Maybe this is controversial, maybe it's not. I don't really expect Weibo to be the type of team that excels in best of fives. They have a pretty predictable strategy. I think Tarzan is one of those players that if you take him out of the game, he can be kind of useless, and the rest of the team is certainly not in a position at the moment for me to expect them to step up. I think JDG should have a pretty decent, scenario as long as Kanavi actually plays well, and if that happens, they should be moving on, so they're going to make the top 4. And then Top Esports versus Anyone's Legend. This was a super easy one. This is Top Esports. I like AL. I'm the biggest AL fan in the world. They are not beating TES in a best of 5. I would be stunned, like truly stunned, if they ended up doing that. They just do not have the firepower. They don't match up well in basically any lane against TES, so this was a very easy choice. They're going to be moving on, but that gets us to our top 4, and it's the top 4 everyone expected. What a shock. I'm not predicting anything crazy here. I think these are by far the 4 best teams in the LPL at the current moment, but let's see how it breaks down moving forward. But we are going to move on to JDG taking on Bilibili Gaming, and I have Bilibili moving on here. This was a pretty easy choice as well. I don't think JDG matches up particularly well into BLG. I think mid lane could be a pretty big problem for JDG, and I think BLG just has a lot of experience here. I think slowing down the game might actually work really well against a team like JDG that doesn't really have a lot of consistency going into the late game, so Bilibili I think is going to be just fine here. And then on the lower bracket, a much more interesting matchup in my opinion, LNG Esports taking on Top Esports. LNG is one of the few teams to actually have a win over Top Esports this split, but I don't have that happening again here. Top Esports is going to move on to winners finals for me. It's just hard to not see them in the crazy hot form that they're in right now. And, LNG is a good team, but they have their own weaknesses. And I just really trust Top Esports to be able to exploit those and capitalize on the mistakes that they're making. So they move on to winners finals, but that is going to bring us to our lower bracket, our 4th, 3rd place matchup, if you will. JD Gaming taking on LNG. This is a fun one. I actually think these two teams are very evenly matched. And I thought for quite a while, going through a lot of stats onto who I wanted to put on the winners column here, who I wanted to move forward. But I ended up landing on JD Gaming. I just think that they're a bit better at the top level. I think Kanavi and Ruler are just kind of a duo that I don't expect LNG to be able to match all that consistently in a best of 5. I understand that they do have strengths, and honestly, if Scout is just straight up better than Yagao in every single game, LNG is going to win this series. I could see that being a big problem. And honestly, I don't know how Shear's going to perform in the playoffs. Perhaps Zika just demolishes him. I think that's a real possibility, and I can see a world in which LNG is just better than a lot of people are claiming they are, including me, but I'm going to have them going out here, even though I do think they are better than they are getting credit for. I just think the rest of the league is also better than they are getting credit for, which leads us to our winners finals to determine the semifinals here. Bilibili taking on Top Esports. I have Bilibili Gaming going through. I just think they're a more complete roster at the moment. The real only concern that I have for BLG is whether or not their playstyle is going to be too slow to take advantage of some of the other teams that can speed things up, like Top Esports. But what if that's not even a problem? What if they just speed things back up in the playoffs? What if Wei's change in playstyle and direction for this team doesn't even end up lasting? Like, that's all a theoretical what-if problem for BLG, and I just can't, put my summer playoff, predictions on the line in that situation. So Bilibili is going to be the team that I move on. Top Esports staying alive moves down to semifinals, losers finals, if you will. It's Top Esports, JD Gaming, and I've got Top Esports. I really do think they're clearly the second best team right now in the LPL. JD Gaming has their problems, and I think this is probably the extent of what they can do with the limited pieces they have at their disposal at the current moment. This is still a very good run for them to get 3rd, but I have Top Esports going back to the finals, and I have back-to-back finals for BLG versus TES. I think that they are clearly the 2 best teams in the LPL at the moment, and honestly, I would be a bit surprised if either of them ended up missing finals. Maybe LNG or JDG or hell, even Weibo Gaming goes on a miracle run to get here, but these are definitely the 2 teams that I think I and everyone else are anticipating to meet in the finals once again. But who do I have going over? Just barely Bilibili Gaming. And I'm going to say it right now. I'm going to say it in this video. If Top Esports wins this split, I'm going to cry, because I spent real time in real life sitting here, not looking at stats. I've already done that. I've looked at this matchup. I've gone through it in my head, but just staring at a wall being God, but I want to pick Top Esports. I want to pick them so bad. I'm not going to give in to temptation here. Just my logic brain ends up prevailing, and I have to pick Bilibili because, again, I think TES's weaknesses are just bigger than BLG's. I'm really worried about Knight and Cream. I think that matchup could be really bad for Top Esports if Knight is in good form, which I expect he will be. But man, if Top Esports wins this split and I didn't pick them here after how long I considered picking them, I'm going to have a conniption. Like, I'm going to lose my mind. Trust me, there is nobody that thinks that Top Esports can win the league more than I can right now. More than I can see it right now. So I really, really want to make that clear. I think this is a lot closer of a race than people are giving it credit for. But I do still have the defending champions, Bilibili Gaming, coming out on top. But that's going to do it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think Top Esports can do it? Do you think someone else? LNG, JD Gaming, Weibo Gaming, I don't know, Invictus Gaming. Who do you think can end up, going on that run and winning the summer playoffs? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, let me know all your thoughts on the video as well. If you enjoyed it, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL, although we are going to post about the LPL every single series in the playoffs, and we'll be covering that all the way up until the end of the year. We'll go into Worlds obviously after that, but we cover all 4 of the major regions as well: LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in that kind of comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.